Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Greatest Games podcast on the Blizzard. My name is Marcus Speller. With me is Jonathan Wilson, and with us today is Matthew Lorenzo, television presenter, having worked for many years in the business for the likes of the BBC, ITV, and Sky Sports. Matthew is also a film producer and has worked on a number of films, including Bobby, the film about the life of Sir Bobby Moore. Matthew, a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
Today, we go back to the World Cup final of 1982 in Madrid, which finished Italy 3, West Germany 1. Matthew, why have you chosen this game?
I don't know. I do know. I'm half Italian. I was never born there. Don't speak a word of the language. My father was born in London. He was chemically 100% Italian. And I think in true Italian style, that allows me to cover my bets when it comes to England and Italy. And I was certainly covering them back in 1982. And that's when, England, Italy were more important to me at that time, mainly because my mate was genuinely Italian. And when they won that game, we ended up driving my Ford Escort round and round Trafalgar Square with a load of other Italian people. And I wore the hooter out. The hooter stopped working. And it's just memories like that. They are rose tinted. They're golden memories. And the whole tournament was great. And that ending, to rush to the ending here at the start, was just fantastic. And I'd watched it on the telly. A year previously, I'd been sports editor of the Walthamstow Guardian, which I used to call the Guardian, which was a fantastic technique for getting tickets for stuff. It wouldn't stretch getting me tickets to go to a World Cup. But I watched it on the telly, and that followed on from having seen the 78 World Cup on the telly and falling in love with our dealers and the rest of them. And then it's just, we all watch these things on the television. I saw the 1970 World Cup. I loved that. I remember crying after the Germany game as I was lying on the carpet wondering why he'd substituted Bobby Charlton. And before that, there was 66, which I missed because my mother took advantage of the fact there was no traffic on the road. So she then took me to the barbers. So I missed the World Cup final.
Oh, dear.
The more confusing thing with hindsight is what the hell the barber was doing open.
Yeah.
But anyway, I've managed to lead you right off the track, which is what I tend to do. But yeah, it's basically because I love that tournament. I thought it was a great footballing tournament. I became a proper Italy fan, hedging my bets as things went on. I've got a man love thing for Paolo Rossi. It was the whole package for me.
Yeah, a number of good reasons. Jonathan, the 1982 World Cup. See, I came in 1990 with regards to World Cups, but I've heard many people talk about the 1982 World Cup, saying it was, as Matthew said there, in a football sense, obviously, very entertaining and a very, very good World Cup. People often go back to that one and speak of it in these terms.
Yeah, I mean, I do, but it was my first World Cup. And I think it doesn't matter how old you are, or which World Cup it happens to be, your first World Cup is always special. It sort of sets the parameters of what a World Cup should be. So I'm sort of glad that other people give me validation when I sort of think it was the best World Cup ever. Yeah. But just watching the highlights back of this final, just the aesthetic of it is perfect. Shirts should look like that. Shorts should be that length. The pitch should look like that. The definition on the camera should be not too sharp, but not quite as fuzzy as it was in 86. This was just right. The noise, the air horns, that's what foreign football sounded like. Even sort of the graphics on the screen, or when you saw the scoreboard, and it was in Spanish, because obviously the World Cup's in Spain, it sort of gives it that glamour, that sense of exoticism. And so I think more than anything else, this tournament was what made me fall in love with football. So I was, this game was this was the 11th of July, the final. So this game was 2 days after my 6th birthday. But yeah, that World Cup was what really got me into football.
Yeah, 2 days before I was actually born, Jonathan. So, what a momentous time it was. but Matthew, it was the last World Cup in which England were more recent world champions than Italy, quite incredibly, because the last time Italy had won the World Cup before 82 was in 1938, which seems quite a long time considering what we think of Italy now, with great pedigree and have won many tournaments. Obviously, regrettably, from my point of view, Euro 2020 being a recent major tournament win. What did you think of Italy at the time? They finished fourth at the European Championships in 1980. Were you, as you said, you sort of hedge your bets and so on. Did you think that Italy could do something at this tournament?
No, not really. I'm a West Ham fan, so I'm not used, apart from recent weeks, I'm not really used to having a team that I expect to do well. You know, the expectation is that they won't, and the same applied in this World Cup. It's just the way things panned out. 3 group games, they didn't win any of them, and yet they managed to scrape in by virtue of having scored more goals than Cameroon. That's not an auspicious start. But from that point onwards, they beat the favourites Argentina, they beat Brazil in arguably the best game of the tournament, they beat Poland. I think very rapidly they made themselves favourites for that game against the Germans.
Well, they were definitely had the sort of popular will behind them, because this Germany was so hideously unpopular. Yeah. I mean, there's obviously, from an English point of view, there's all the normal reasons to do with Germany, but also you'd had the fixed game, or not the fixed game, but the game where they and Austria played out a very convenient 1-0 win, so both went through at Algeria's expense in the final group game in Gijón. Which actually, which brought condemnation from within Germany as well. There were a lot of Germany fans who, I remember Uli Hesse telling me about, I can't remember his name, but there was sort of a famous German Uber fan who followed them at every game, every friendly. He'd be there. He stayed in the team hotel. He'd been following them from 1954, and from that game in Gijón against Austria, he said he could never watch them again. So it wasn't just an English reaction against that West Germany. They were very unpopular. And then you had the semi-final against France and the Schumacher-Battiston incident, and a beautiful French side, 3-1 up in extra time and managing to lose it on penalties.
But I mean, Jonathan, you also had, though, I mean, perhaps people in England were maybe not so aware, but the backdrop of this, of course, not too dissimilar to 2006 with Italy, the Tottenero scandal, the match fixing scandal.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. And we should talk about that. But I think the immediacy of what happened with West Germany, people, it wasn't like today where we go into a tournament knowing everything about every team. There was some, people who knew would have known, but the vast majority of the public would have said, some scandal, whatever. But West Germany, you're actually watching it in the tournament. You're seeing this disgrace. But yeah, the Tottenero scandal was obviously, I mean, on Rossi particularly.
Yeah, Rossi was caught up in this. A number of teams in Italy were, and so don't want to get too sidetracked with this. But he was suspended. What was it for 3 matches, or was it 3
years?
3 years. Sorry,
3 years.
3 years. Sorry, yeah.
And then the last year that was remitted, so he could play in the World Cup.
Yeah,
so, I mean, he always protested his innocence, and I think it's very murky as to what his knowledge of what was going on was. But it was a classic Italian match fixing scandal that led to AC Milan being relegated. Arrests on the pitch in 79 or in 80. 80, I think must have been.
Yeah, it was 80.
Final game of the season. Police literally by the side of the pitch. So it was an enormous scandal, and it wasn't just Rossi who was affected, but he was the one who got the ban, and he was the one who was brought back. Just before the tournament. I mean, one of the reasons why Italy didn't win any of those group games, actually, if you watch them back, they don't play as badly as I think the popular myth suggests. I think they're actually the better team in all 3 games, but they can't score because Rossi's way off the pace.
Yeah, and Matthew, had he have been banned, then your man crush with Paolo Rossi may not have been a thing, which would have been quite a shame. But as Jonathan said, it took a while to get going. The old cliches, notorious slow starters, and so on. But in that second group phase, and it was the last World Cup to have 2 rounds of group stages, if you like, Italy were faced with Argentina and Brazil, as you mentioned earlier, which was, by any stretch of the imagination, no mean feat. Beat Argentina 2-1 and famously overcame that great Brazil side, which many people thought might have won the World Cup that year. And that was where we saw Paolo Rossi really burst onto the scene in that game, where he scored a hat-trick. Was it that hat-trick that caught your imagination with Rossi?
Yeah, well, I wasn't a football expert, so I was new to him and new to well, they're new to Italy winning things, as we've discussed before. Yeah, so that wasn't a bad start for him and for Italy to actually get their act in gear. It was a fantastic game. And I think generally the neutral supports Brazil. And I think most people were at that time. And it could be argued that their self-discipline or lack of self-discipline led to that defeat. But I prefer to think not, that it didn't. Rossi spoke about scoring goals. And I think it's the whole thing about scoring goals is quite interesting, because I met Steve Archibald a couple of years ago. It was an interview about something else, but he said at one point, you make documentaries, don't you? I said, yes. And he said, I'd love to make a documentary about what happens when you score. I mean, you could call it the art of scoring, but it's a bit more than that, because I did it and I sometimes couldn't understand how I did it. And Rossi describes getting a goal. I was a tenth of a second faster than the defender, and I knew I was going to put it into the net and that he wouldn't catch me. Now, how can you quantify a tenth of a second? But there he's trying to explain what I think Archibald was trying to explain, which I don't understand, having two left legs, what it is about scoring goals. That there is something magical about it that you can't quite put your finger on. And I'm demonstrating someone not being able to put his finger on something. But Archibald, who knows more about scoring goals than I ever would, says there's something there. And it would be a fascinating documentary to get him to explain that. Rossi was a fantastic goal scorer. I think, can't mention him in the same breath, but I'm going to do it. Lineker was a fantastic goal scorer, usually from about a yard out. I think all of that is very interesting. You may disagree.
No. I mean, I think there's two aspects to it. So there's the or two sort of general aspects to it. There's the anticipation, the working out where the ball's going to be, and that could be anticipating the cross, or could be anticipating a bounce off a defender. But there's also the instinct, the reaction, and then being able to control the shot or the header. And there's lots of research being done on this, and essentially it's the mental calculations you have to do are too quick for the human brain. It makes no sense. So there's a very good interview that David Winner did with Wayne Rooney, and they talked for a long time in that interview about his overhead kick against City, the famous winner in the derby. And Rooney sort of explains it very coldly and very rationally, and so says, I saw the ball coming in from the right, I realized it was going to be behind me, I realized I wasn't going to be able to get a head on it, so I turned my body, got between the ball and defender, and I swung my right leg up. And none of this is possible. And so I've read quite a lot of literature on this because this fascinates me. And so there's various tests being done that basically our reflex, our instincts are somehow happen beyond the cognitive powers of the brain. And what the brain does, because it hates this feeling that it's not in control. The brain likes to think it's this sort of great nerve center with some bloke pushing buttons and pulling levers to control everything. So the brain makes up this story of, I saw the ball coming in, and then I put my body here, and then I swung my leg up. And of course, that is what happens. But your body's doing that quicker than the brain. It's quicker than the electrical impulses can move down the nerves from the brain to cause the limbs to move. So I think the whole thing is utterly fascinating. And it does suggest there's something in the unconscious in great sportsmen that can carry out these calculations incredibly quickly, far quicker than the brain can, far quicker than computers can. But sorry, you got me off on one of my hobby horses there. It was,
no. Well,
but you should do that documentary. And
I was about to say, I think he's duty bound, aren't you?
Yeah,
to do that.
Well, I think the thing about Archibald is he's wise enough to appreciate it. That's something worth exploring. Mm-hmm. I haven't done it because when you're doing a documentary, again, I'm wandering off here. You have two questions to ask. One, would I watch it? And two, is someone going to buy it? Now, usually you can give a positive answer to the first one. The second one is a lot stickier. But yeah, I would watch it, definitely.
Yeah.
Well, you've got a talking head in Jonathan Wilson, surely there.
No, you need experts. You need people who actually know what they're talking about. I'm sort of summarising stuff, but it's the same. Yeah, but I mean, we really are drifting off topic here. But you know how Diplodocus because they're so because they're so big.
Who do you play for?
But they normally play out front. The big boys get their head on it, that kind of thing. Swing a tail, son.
Yeah, but this is exactly the point. That they're so big that the distance from the brain to the end of the tail is so great that for the impulses to travel that far would take several seconds. So I don't know if this is a theory whether they actually proved it, but Diplodocus had a secondary brain at the base of their tail, because otherwise the tail would be, it would just take ages for the messages to get there.
Did Peter Crouch have an extra brain? That would be the question. But as loath as I am to go back to Paolo Rossi, Jonathan, he obviously scored, to say that hat trick against Brazil and showed his cunning. What Matthew was saying there, that quoting Archibald and so on, he really showed his cunning in that game. It's sort of
you've also got to bear in mind the pressure he was under. So he'd been brought back. They'd done this sort of fiddle, call it whatever you want, to make sure he can play in the World Cup. And he's gone 4 games without scoring and it hasn't played particularly well. And I'm sure
Berzot was under pressure to drop it.
Yeah, he was. And it's great credit to Berzot that he didn't. And of course, you can go back now and you can sort of look at games. Oh, you look at his movement. Oh, his movement's fantastic. And actually, he was playing very well. But he's a centre forward who hasn't scored in four games, having been brought back specially. And so, he's under enormous pressure in that Brazil game. And the first goal in that game, I mean, I'm sure we will do this game in a future podcast. But I think it's interesting the order of the goals coming in that game, that the first goal is the back post header from the Cabrini cross, which is sort of an instinctive finish. There's no sort of time to think. The other two, he has time. And I wonder whether he'd have been able to take the other two if he hadn't scored that goal first. Yeah. But that game against Brazil, I didn't have the same, even as a sort of 5-year-old, I was sort of quite curmudgeonly, and I kind of got grumpy at how much everybody wanted Brazil to win. So I was definitely sort of quite pleased that Italy beat them in that game. And then was desperately, once England had gone out, was desperately wanting Italy to win the tournament. So that team, I'm pretty sure as a 5 or 6-year-old, I could have rattled off all the starting 11 very, very easily. And so I had a great sort of nostalgic rush watching the highlights back and seeing Bruno Conti making those runs down the right, and Cabrini. I love Cabrini, the attacking left back. Oriali at the back in midfield, and then you had Gentile, who was that camera followed him against Argentina and purely focused on his battle with Maradona, and you saw how he pulled his shirt and tore his shirt, but was constantly bumping him, constantly barging him, and you sort of saw a bit of the darker side of defending and the sort of I guess the qualities we attribute to Italian defenders. And then Rossi was the final link, the sort of ruthless finisher. And after the Brazil game, he was 3 in that game, 2 against Poland, and then 1 in the final.
All the sort of stuff that a 5-year-old lad from Sunderland could definitely get past. None of that beautiful stuff for me. Thank you very much. All right, chaps, let's have a quick break and then we'll talk about the match after. Welcome back to the Greatest Games podcast on the Blizzard. So then, we've talked about Paolo Rossi. We mentioned Enzo Berzot, the manager. What are your memories of him, Matthew, the man nicknamed the Old Man? I
tell you what, memories, as I mentioned earlier, facts aren't my business. I'm not great at facts, but I did look up a few for this one. Just as a quick aside, and I'm all about asides, my boss at Sky handed me the research. They offer you a telephone book full of research and stats before a game. I think it was a playoff final. There's a fact I can't remember. But I do remember him saying, take these, Matthew. There's a word there that you won't understand. I said, what's that one? And he pointed at one that said prep. So preparation. It's very unfair because it's unfair. Anyway, prep for this I did. And there were 2 fascinating things that I found. And the one that I can remember is that Berzot spent 40 minutes in Rossi's hotel room before the final. And he was under an immense amount of pressure. They all were at the time, talking about cubism which he had to prep up on himself because Rossi apparently was an art expert, a passionate man about art. And so in order to relax him, they had this bizarre conversation about Salvador Dali and Pablo Picasso, which apparently calmed him down. That is not a conversation that I think was held with Gaza at any point, or Wayne Rooney. I found it fascinating. Bertzold, very brave man. I mean, we were talking earlier about how Rossi hadn't scored for a while. I think it was something like 3 years since he'd hit the back of the net. And he'd been described as a ghost in the group games, the way he was just wandering around and not getting in front of goal. So I think Bertzold's faith in him was overwhelming. And of course, you know, he's been paid back now, but at the time, he must have been under an awful lot of pressure, worse than that, I suspect, because the Italian press make out sort of like kindergarten sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, he did call for a sort of, I forget the Italian term for, but a sort of a press blackout at some point during the tournament.
But I think that kind of helped, didn't it? They did have a media silence, and I think it was after the second group game, it's after they drawn against Peru. But it's a bit like England in 1990. They had something similar after the allegations of hanky panky in Sardinia, and I think that's the sense as a common enemy, I think, can be quite a useful thing for a team, certainly in the short term. And I think it probably was a bonding thing for this Italy side, because they actually they had quite a lot of bad luck as well. I mean, Bergami was only playing. Bergami was 18. He was only playing because of injuries. They lost Colavati during the tournament, and then Graziani gets injured quarter of an hour into the final.
Well,
So they were losing players,
injured, wasn't he? Antonioni.
Antonioni was out injured. Yeah.
Yeah.
Antonioni was out injured. Colavati was carrying an injury. Sorry.
Yeah. So it was, and he changed the shape to sort of what would you call it? A sort of a 5-2-3.
Well, it's the I think this is one of the odd things about Italian football from the 60s onwards that it took me a long time to sort of get my head around. But there's an inbuilt asymmetry to it. So this is what they call, and I'm sure Matthew will correct my Italian, but il gioco all'italiano.
Close enough.
Which is, thank you, which is sort of the next stage on from Catenaccio. So you have the sweeper, and then you have sort of four in front of them, but the left back is very attacking. So the left back sort of almost, he covers the whole of the left wing. He's his left wing back. So that's Cabrini. And Bergami as the right back tucks in as a marker. And then to balance that, you have Conti wide on the right as a tornante. Or is that a Spanish term? So shuttling back. So he's also covering the whole of the flank, but he's doing it from further up. Then you have Oriali sitting in the back of midfield, Tardelli sort of making breaks forward, and Graziani as the second striker were playing out to the left to link with Cabrini. And all Italian teams played in that asymmetric way. But when you're playing against that, then the positions match up, that your sort of advanced right-sided player who shuttles back is up against the attacking left back. So they naturally mark each other. And when Hamburg win the European Cup against Juve in the following year in '83, they deliberately play on that, and they pull Tardelli out of position. I think it's Felix Magath who does a job on him. And it's a very simple thing, just refusing to play into the symmetry that all Italian teams play with. But yeah, that's how that team's set up. It's the sweeper, then four in front, of which the left back is very attacking, and then I guess you'd say, I guess you'd call it a 5-3-2, but it's not a sort of symmetrical 5-3-2.
Yeah, within that system, Matthew, Gaetano Scirea, the sweeper, was a very important player in that side. Do you have any memories of him being dominant at the back and sort of breaking through with the ball?
See, this is when you get a journalist answering a journalist. So Scirea I don't want to talk about, but I'll be polite and say that's a good point you're making about Scirea, but I'd love to talk about Gentile. No one knows.
Oh, far away. Speak about who you fancy.
Yeah, Gentile is my man.
Right.
Because he was the enforcer, if you like.
Here's me thinking you were more cultured when it came to your defenders.
He's a West Ham fan, of course not.
Yeah, well,
actually, Bobby Moore.
Bobby Moore, yeah.
But Bobby Moore, I spent 3 years of my life making a film about him. But I like Gentile because he was an enforcer. And we've all got them. For West Ham, Billy Bonds used to do the dirty work with great aplomb. I think Dave Mackay did it for Spurs. And I think Gentile did it for Italy. It's almost like you're on the side of the bully. So you don't mind if you're on the side of the bully, that's fine. And to call him a bully is probably doing him a disservice. But he spent 2 days watching videos of Maradona before he was sent out to man mark him. He ended up fouling him 21 times, which must be something of a record. Didn't get him sent off. In fact, in 500 games, he never got sent off for violent conduct, which I find incredible. He then did his homework on Adair before the Brazil game, only to be told he was marking Zico. I think Zico got his shirt ripped in that one too. And then in the final, he got Lipvarski and I think snuffed him out. So he's the player that I quite admire. He wouldn't be the most obvious candidate. I think he's been voted the dirtiest player in World Cup history, but I think that's a little unfair. Let's go back to Chiré if you like. I don't mind.
No, but you're right to say that, because Gentile, people who know him think of him as you say, trying to wrestle Maradona to the floor and sort of beat him up. But actually, the preparation that he did, and he was a great man marker, Jonathan. He was very effective, and he's a World Cup winner.
Yeah, and that's the system. You need those two centre backs, Gentile and Collaverti, to be great man markers. And Chiré, obviously the tragedy, he dies in '89 in a car crash in Poland on a scouting trip for Juve, and that's maybe that colours perception slightly, but I think he was a slightly strange defender for an Italian. There's a fragility to him. Because he did make those great runs forward. He did go beyond that line of the defence. He was a libero in the more sort of Northern European sense, the way that Beckenbauer would have been, or Kroll or something like that. So he plays a key part certainly in the second half of the final, getting forward. So yeah, he was. I mean, it's a banal thing to say, but he was a lovely player.
Yeah, I was a hell of a spine for that side. So we've mentioned Rossi, Tardelli, but I'm sure we'll mention him again and so on. But Dino's off in goal. I mean, it isn't too shabby. But let's get to the match itself. And as you mentioned earlier, Jonathan, the sound of the crowd, set the old Bernabeu and so on. I mean, it really was a proper showpiece final. Matthew, what are your memories of sitting down and watching the game and kind of taking it all in?
I think Jonathan made a good point about the quality of the pictures. It wasn't HD, but it wasn't Mexico, and it was just the right sort, and the captions were just the right sort. All you really needed, nothing too flash about them. And the build-up was great. The anticipation was fantastic. And then, as I say, my relationship with Rossi, one-sided because he knew nothing about me, was, the first goal was terrific. It didn't look like a great goal, but if you analyse it, which I'm sure Jonathan can do better than I, it was a brilliant goal for a poacher, which is a demeaning term, really. It's the one that I was talking about where he was a tenth of a second ahead, and he knew in that time that we discussed earlier, that time that the human brain has no cognizance of, that he was going to beat him and score the goal. So that was terrific. I could go on to the other goals, but anyway, that's how it.
But I think that goal also, it shows the quality of Gentile, because it's his cross. Yes. So people think of him as a thug, but it's a quick free kick taken by Tardelli out to Gentile, who whips in this really good cross. And Cabrini, who's missed a penalty in the first half, just can't quite get there the near post. And then Rossi bundles in at the back post, got ahead of his marker, which is exactly what you're saying. That just having that reaction that's a tenth of a second faster than the defender. So he gets his body between the ball and the defender, and then it doesn't really matter what contact he gets; it's going to go in. Yeah.
And it's funny because both defenders we've been talking about, Gentile and Chiré, were both, as you say, instrumental in the two goals. It was 11 minutes later. Chiré wins the ball. He sort of starts the move from deep, as he'd like to do, moves up with play. And I'm pretty sure, Jonathan, it's him who plays the ball to Tardelli.
It is. It's Breitner is dispossessed, I think, by Gentile. I couldn't quite. It wasn't quite clear on. I couldn't.
But that's the drawback with those pictures that you.
Yeah, like, from the position on the pitch, I think it must be him. It's possible it was Bergamy tucking in, but it's actually a bad pass from Rummenigge, who had a poor tournament. He's carrying an injury, never quite lived up to his billing, And
he also a few goals in the tournament, though.
Yeah, but he was never quite. I don't think he was quite. It is. I mean, I know he had he was more injured in '86, but I think sort of I think Rummenigge is underestimated as a player outside of Germany because his 2 World Cups he wasn't quite at his best, and also he's playing in that slightly odd right-sided role with Fischer through the middle, and it's Breitner. And Breitner, we think of as a fullback, but he was playing in midfield, gets dispossessed. Schreier then picks up the ball, surges forward. He exchanges passes with Conti and then carries on his run. So this is the point about him not being a sort of a traditional libero. He's much more Northern European in outlook. Takes the ball into the box and then cuts it back for Tardelli, who I think miscontrols it.
Yeah, I agree with you.
It turns out to be a brilliant touch, but his first touch, surely he didn't want to go that wide, but it creates the space for the shot, and then he lashes it in the bottom corner.
Are you suggesting he'd be disappointed with that?
I think he'd be quite happy. He looked quite happy.
He looked very happy. He looked like a man who had just made amends for a huge mistake, and there was relief and all sorts of expression in his face. But it's the
celebration. Yeah.
The celebration is amazing, Matthew. I mean, you talked earlier about the kind of the emotions of watching the World Cup, especially a World Cup when all the ingredients seem to be there and so on. But his face just sums up, for me anyway, the passion and everything with football. What, again, your memories of that moment?
Yeah, that's the face that you remember, not just from that game, that competition, but I think from every World Cup. Some idiot poll, they voted it 4th. Why it isn't top, I don't know. Maybe I'm biased towards the Italians. But he said that in that moment, it's a bit like just before you die, you see your whole life flash before you. He said, I saw my whole career from being a kid before my eyes, and that was the realization of the dream that I'd had since I was a child. Now, that's an Italian being very emotive, but I can sort of get what he means, because the look on his face, I mean, if you could describe ecstasy, or you could portray ecstasy, it would be that. And it was an ecstasy shared by an entire nation. So that's a glorious, glorious image, and deserves to be on every World Cup titles package from here to eternity.
But it's also the aesthetic of it, his hair soaking with sweat, sort of flying back. I'm sure if it were in the HD, you'd have been able to see the individual beads of sweat flying off, the shirt sort of clinging to him. It's and the light is just right. It's just dark enough. It's an incredibly beautiful image. And do you know what he was shouting as he ran over to the bench?
Do you know?
Yes.
Oh, go on then. Tell me.
0-0.
He was shouting.
I didn't mean that.
Sorry about the poor touch. Yeah.
He was shouting Marco Tardelli. He was just screaming his own name.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I kind of wish you'd never told me that.
No, I think it's kind of. I mean, there's 2 ways of looking at it. You could say there's a weird arrogance to it, but I think the more romantic way, or the more sort of innocent way, is it's like he's commentating on himself. He's screaming his own name, because that's what you do in the playground when you score a great goal.
Absolutely. Instead of pretending he was Marco Tardelli, he actually was Marco Tardelli. And he was that 8-year-old realizing his dream. Yeah, I'll go with that, Jonathan.
Yeah, I hear you did something similar, Jonathan, recently in a cricket match, but the less said about that, the better. But Italy 2-0 up, and I mean, with that kind of celebration as well, it really was. Again, I say this not having watched the match live, but it seemed to be, that was probably game over.
Well, 21 minutes to go.
Well, I know, but the manner of the celebration.
And also, famously, what should you never do with Germans? Never write them off.
Never write them off, yeah. Well, you're true enough. I mean, the next goal comes for Italy, 12 minutes later. And, I mean, Germany looked done, didn't they? Altobelli's got plenty of time to control the ball, Jonathan. I mean, talk us through the goal, because it
so
pretty
it's
easy.
Conti, who I think Conti was probably Italy's best player in the tournament. Yeah, for all that, Rossi obviously got the goals, and Gentile was vital, and Tardelli was vital, and Oriali and Schreier and Cabrini all had great tournaments, and Bergami was there as an 18-year-old. I think Conti's actually the probably their best player in that tournament. And he gets away down the right and cuts. It's a very strange goal. Cuts the ball across. And Tardelli, who's come on for Graziani, I don't know how he's conceivably in that much space. But he's just sort of, 12 yards out in loads of space. And Schumacher comes flying off his line. And he sort of just knocks the ball around him, at which, three defenders suddenly appear, but he just has to knock it into the net, which he does.
Yeah, and it was all too easy. And surely then by that point, Matthew, you were celebrating because that was the game over.
Well, what that helped actually with is my knowledge of the Italian language, which is minimal. It's Grazia and Birra and stuff like that. And now it's Rossi, Tardelli, Altobelli, 3-1, which is all I have to say whenever I meet an Italian, either here or there, and they smile and I'm in. And I recommend it to both of you. Rossi, Tardelli, Altobelli. And my memory of that is, yes, we've won it. And my thoughts were echoed, I think, by Sandro Bettini, the Italian president, who you can see in the box standing up and getting very, very excited and looking like a cross between Enzo Ferrari and a mafia don. And I think he turns at one stage and wags his finger. Could have been at Juan Carlos, who was there as guest of honor, or the entire German delegation. But it was as if to say, at 3-0 up with not long to go, you can't catch us now, which make him a very brave pundit in my book. But yeah, it was celebrations all the way around the house then, and they scored their goal, but it was merely a consolation. And you could see by their reaction that they knew it was beyond them at that point.
Yeah. Paul Brighton obviously gets a consolation.
And so becomes one of, I think, still only 3 players to score in 2 World Cup finals.
I believe so.
With Pelé and Vavá. But it's actually quite poor defending. After all we said about Italy, it's Conti, who's about half the size of Hans-Peter Briegel, famously a former decathlete. You can't talk about Hans-Peter Briegel without saying he was a former decathlete. But he was a huge muscular bloke. And Conti somehow knocks him to the ground just outside the box. Hansi Müller takes the free kick. And then there's 2 attempts to clear it. And neither are particularly convincing. And Breitner volleys it in. But there's 5 minutes to go. And yeah, there's no real celebration. There's not even really a rush to get the ball out of the net. They sort of know it's done.
Shame for Dino Zoff not to keep a clean sheet, but I'm sure he'll not be too fussed, Jonathan. But a little word on him. He made his debut.
I mean, 40 years old. Yeah, had been there all the way through. It was a great calming presence.
1968, he made his debut for the Italian national side.
Yeah,
he'd been there for a while,
and followed the tradition of goalkeepers captaining Italy to World Cup glory after Combi in 34. Yeah. But yeah, he never quite know. And particularly in those days, he didn't know to what extent he was doing the organising of the defence and to what extent it was Shiraya. But clearly his sort of calmness and his experience were key. And he makes that brilliant save against Brazil about 5 minutes ago, the header from Oscar, that he not only gets down to his left, but he holds it. That's a save that I think should be talked about far more, because if that had gone in, Italy don't go through. They had to win that game. A draw would have put them out. And Zoff, Rossi, understandably gets a hat-trick, so gets all the praise. But Zoff makes a really, really good reflex save with a few minutes to go that keeps them ahead. Yeah.
And Matthew, how long was it after the final whistle you were out and about in your mate's car around central London?
It was my car. It was my Ford Escort.
Sorry.
Yes. We headed straight from Woodford in Essex, where he lived, straight to Trafalgar Square to join the throng. And it was just fantastic. It was as though.
So how many Italians were there?
It was mobbed, absolutely mobbed. In fact, it had been a centre for celebration in the preceding games. Another mate's father, for some reason, and I have no idea why, dressed up as Mussolini and was on the back of a cart being pulled by 2 donkeys when he was arrested, because this was seen as, I don't know if the word inciting, I don't know. But
inappropriate, maybe.
Anyway, winding up the crowd. And yeah, it was carnage, but it was fantastic. Because there's one thing you can say about the Italians, they do know how to celebrate, and they have a joy about them, which is infectious. And I was thoroughly a part of that. It was great.
Marvellous. Well, Matthew, it's been a pleasure talking to you about this game. and hearing some of your memories pre, during, and post match.
I could tell you one more before you.
Oh, please do. Go on.
So I'm now working for Sky, and I'm doing German football, Bundesliga, with Tony Woodcock, and we become mates. And Tony, who used to play for Cologne, had a good relationship with the club, so he would organise England matches against Germany, and there was a second one against Italy. Now, Gordon Banks played in one, Hurston Peters played, Mick Mills. I mean, it was a star-studded lineup, and one sub, who you're listening to now. And I played against Paolo Rossi in the England-Italy game. And it was there that I got my nickname, One Touch, because I came on for the last 20 minutes and I touched it once. So that's, I played against Paolo Rossi. That's where I should leave it, really, shouldn't I?
Well, if I may, how important was that touch?
Not very important.
Oh, okay.
Not at all. I mean, it could be argued that it hit me rather than I hit it.
Maybe we'll give you the benefit of the doubt, like Wayne Rooney and Steve Archibald and Paolo Rossi. You just can't explain that touch. It just sort of happened. You know, it was all about the it was about the body overtaking the brain. But there we are. Thank you very much, Matthew. It's been a pleasure. And for more stories like that, do check out theblizzard.co.uk, everybody. Jonathan and I will, of course, be back next week with another great game from the history of football. See you then.